Welcome to the 11th episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to give our hot takes on the latest UTSA athletics news and throw some Hail Mary shots downfield for our listeners to love or hate. Well, I think we have to start with this week's big news on the coaching front in women's basketball. UTSA hired Karen Aston to head the women's basketball program. By far, she is probably the biggest name we've ever had in women's athletics here at UTSA. And just in general, she's probably really our second biggest named hire in the school program history after Larry Coker.
Yeah.
So do you think Lisa Campos hit it out of the ballpark with this hire?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she did really well with the hire, but I think what's bigger here and what's probably not as focused on is the contract, because it's incentive laden. But much like Jeff Traylor's contract, those incentives are based on promoting UTSA and UTSA athletics.
Right.
So I think Lisa is really looking at these coaches and saying, I want my coaches out in the San Antonio area promoting UTSA, not only as a university, but the athletics department, and really trying to kind of manufacture some, interest from all the locals that probably aren't UTSA alumni, but she can possibly drive them to go in and showing up, buying tickets, with just getting that word out. So I think that contract's key. This is the second time I've heard of, you got those incentives. Like I said, I mentioned Traylor. Now you see Karen Aston. I think Karen Aston, her pedigree is clearly impeccable. She's coached at a ton of places and has seen success. So just based on the contract and then based on some of the things she said within her hiring, where she talked about the talent pool in San Antonio, I think she's going to recruit San Antonio, much like Jeff Traylor. And I think you're starting to see, even with these contracts, is seeing these coaches really start to focus on the San Antonio area.
Yeah. And, Karen Aston was she was fired, I guess you can say, from UT. Her contract was allowed to expire at the end of the 2019-2020 season. But she was, at that point, the winningest coach at UT in terms of their women's program. So, it's kind of, in some ways, a surprise to see her then come to UTSA, because she was obviously someone who had, like you said, a great pedigree, a great history. She is used to winning. She's worked in Conference USA before at North Texas and at Charlotte. But for her to come off of, a program like UT where, in our standards, she would have been, exceptional. But for UT, they looked at it as, okay, she couldn't beat Baylor. She couldn't get us to a conference champion, and that's just not good enough for UT. But she really, was still performing well when she was there. So then for her to, take a year off and come back to a program like UTSA is really, I think, a substantial, hire for us.
First of all, how ridiculous is it that they kind of judge her, and the biggest black mark can't be Baylor. Baylor is a top women's program, has been for a long time. Right. I get that, at some point you have to beat them, and she only had one. I think she went 1-18 against them, but right. Just to focus on one team and say, oh, you can't beat them. I mean, it seems like UT is behind in several sports like that. You look at the football team, struggles against Oklahoma. Oklahoma's their biggest rival, struggles against them. And that's how UT football coaches are getting fired now, because can't beat Oklahoma, or they can kind of play with them, but Oklahoma keeps winning. So, we can talk about how ridiculous it seems, but you're right. I think getting her here, I think she's got roots. Don't remember how old her daughter is, but it seems like still pretty young. And I think she just wants to keep her in the area. I think they really just like living, this I-35 kind of corridor between San Antonio and Austin. So having her dip in here, I think is, really 80 miles south of Austin. I think it's going to be a good thing. But more importantly to me, I think that with her pedigree, I think she's going to be able to really garner some more interest in the program. And that's really big here because as much as we've talked about Karen Aston, her contract, how good a coach she is, it's clear that Lisa Campos is investing in UTSA sports by looking at these coaches and finding good coaches to come in and garner some interest in these programs. And like you said, I don't know that previously we would have gotten a look from Karen Aston. It's clear that she saw something here that, interested her to say, yeah, I want to sign up, because this program's in a deep, deep hole. It's Brooks Thompson level, hole in terms of there needs to be a lot of rebuild here. So clearly she's got some energy or some ideas that she thinks is going to, really get them out and get them playing better. So here's my Hail Mary shot for you. I think she makes UTSA women's basketball relevant in 3 years. I think that, she's, because of her level of coaching and her pedigree, she's going to be able to garner some, I would say, better leveled recruits to compete at the Conference USA level.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I think 3 years is really the time frame that we need to look at for Karen Aston. I mean, I realize she signed either a 5 or 6 year contract, but realistically, someone of her talent is not going to stay that long. She's looking at UTSA to say, this is a broken program. And, for all the same things, reasons that we heard Jeff Traylor come here, we're in a large city. You've got kids that you can recruit that are going to stay in this area. If you show interest in them, we don't have the facilities, but they're coming. But I think she's looking at the program saying, it's not going to get any worse, right? I think we hit the lowest low this past season, so she can only make improvements. And I think she's looking at it as a challenge. And, in 2-3 years max, if she can really take this program from nothing to a competitive program, that just means that she's going to be able to, take the next step and get back into the Power 5, coaching job. And I think that's likely what she's looking for. I don't think she's looking at UTSA as a, long-term gig, but, if we can take the success that we get from her in the short term and then, find that coach after that to continue to propel us forward, we'll still be in a much better, spot than we are right now, for sure.
And that said, I mean, as much as we are lauding Karen Aston and hoping she can revive this basketball team, I mean, we really should look at also the other women's sports, like Coach Groff with the volleyball team, who has continued to put up a really good team. They obviously have their lulls when, you have to replace seniors and, it's just not like a high level Division I team where you can just keep reloading. But she continues to put out some really competitive teams. You've also got Coach Cheatham out there at the softball team. She's put together some really good players that are just absolutely crushing the ball. I wish we could be out there supporting them. I think there's still limitations on attendance, but I think, again, you're starting to see that excitement and really we as not only alumni and fans need to remember that to try to at least hope that either some of these games start getting or pushed to get these games either televised locally or show up and make sure that they, not only the players know, but really the coaches know that you investing in UTSA, putting your time in to make a name out of UTSA is well worth it, because we're all going to be there to celebrate with you, not only in the wins, but also be there for you in your losses. So welcome, Karen Aston, but I know you got a lot of work ahead of you, but like I said, I think there's going to be plenty of us that are going to be there excited to see what you build.
Yeah. All right. So just a quick correction. I said that Karen Aston was the winningest coach at UT. She actually was an assistant under the winningest coach at UT, Jody Conrad. Anyways, now that we've talked a little bit about the women's program, let's, kind of pivot and talk about the men's program for a while. We just learned recently that both Javon Jackson and Keaton Wallace have decided not to come back for their super senior season. And, this season kind of seemed like there was sort of a lot of ups and downs. Started out with lot of angst towards Steve Henson, and then, kind of ended the season on a more of a higher note. So overall, what's your assessment of UTSA's men's basketball program?
Well, I think that, I had said that this was sort of an average team at, close to mid-season when we last did our podcast. And I don't believe that changed. I mean, this team was pretty average, and they did what UTSA teams that are average do. They feasted on the second half of the season on some teams that weren't as good, or, either had losing records or just weren't having good seasons. And again, it's a credit to UTSA being able to handle some of this COVID, because it felt like wherever we go in terms of what sport, no matter what sport it is, UTSA is taking care of themselves COVID-wise. So that's a huge shout out to the coaches and, whoever else has been helping with that approach, because it just seems like it's not UTSA that's having anything moved around. It's other teams that are struggling with it. And I think that shows some leadership. But with Henson, to me, I really felt that with Javon Jackson and with Keaton Wallace, he seemed to kind of be sort of submissive towards them in terms of just letting them kind of do whatever they wanted on the court. And I think it was to the detriment of the team offensively. It seemed like, ball really stagnated when it got into Javon's hands. As soon as the ball gets in Javon's hands, you see him start dribbling, and he's really trying to bombs away. So if you watch the NCAA tournament, which we've gotten a chance to really sit back and watch some of these tournament games, you see some of the better teams, even I'd say the mid-major teams, right where UTSA would really fit in. Those teams that are good are moving the ball around. They're getting that ball moving. It's not sticking in one spot. And so I think that's going to be the adjustment moving forward. Without really having Javon or Keaton around, it feels like we'll be able to have a team that moves the ball around and maybe gets more people involved.
Yeah, kind of going back to the middle of the season, I don't remember what game it was, but there was one of the post games where they had come through and won, and Jacob Germany had said at the end, we won because we really played as a team, and I think that kind of sort of drives home your point where, I think a lot of times, we just put the ball in the hands of Javon, but because Javon was such a streaky player, if he wasn't playing well, sometimes we just weren't able to overcome that, rather than saying, right, okay, Javon's having a bad day. It is what it is. Let's get the ball in other people's hands and let's, kind of keep going. And then, maybe he'll, get a shot back later on. But it was like, if Javon was having a bad day, like the team was just going to have a bad game more often than not.
Yeah. And I think to your just last point there, more often than not, he was struggling because he was always a sort of this undersized just shooter. Mm-hmm. He's a volume shooter. And, you're talking about a kid that was maybe 6 foot at best. So you got a little guy like that, he's going to have to find ways to score. And a lot of the time he felt that it was just easier just to bombs away from, 3 or 4 feet behind the 3-point line. And, he shot better as his career went on, mm-hmm. but still there was just too many times where he just got out of control. And I think that's the biggest need right now, is just to find that distributor, to find that guy that's a leader on the court, a point guard. And I know it sounds in a traditional sense, but you need a ball handler that can move that ball around. And, like you said, on the court leader that can tell someone, hey, you're off. We have to get the ball to Jacob Germany, mm-hmm. Let him really take advantage of his, the inside, because he is a pretty tall player. And I think as the season went on, I felt like he really started coming along as an offensive player. So I think in basketball, you're going to see fewer of these super seniors. It just doesn't make sense to waste another year on the court when you could potentially go overseas or do something. So while, obviously not the ending you wanted for these guys, I feel like moving forward, I think Henson's going to have a team that if he wants to continue, he needs to really get that one run to the tournament. But if he wants to continue finding success, that ball's going to have to move around. And I think without having the volume shooter like Javon, you're going to be able to get that. So get a little more efficient, find that distributor, like did Nick Lau when we had him a couple, like 3 or 4 seasons ago now. But you see how the team has struggled without a guy like Nicolau, but you need a guy like him to come in, do that, and then just improve on the defense. There were times that UTSA played some good defense, and I would really say team defense, individually and team-wise. They played well, but that has to be much more consistent, and that will really lead to, I think, more of the success on the court. It's great to have this quote unquote everybody thinking there's an elite backcourt, but they weren't elite. If they were truly elite, they would have been able to lift us over the hump over a lot of these better teams.
Yeah,
they weren't able to. So
one of the things that I think comes up a lot is the sort of comparison with Henson's team and Brooks Thomas' team, because Brooks got us to the tournament, and you mentioned one of the things that Henson really needs to do is get us to the point where we get into the NCAA tournament. So what is it that we need to see from Henson, or why is it that Henson hasn't been able to get us there?
I really think it's just the transition from Southland to Conference USA. I mean, you look at the kind of player that Charles Bassey is at Western Kentucky, and you realize there's just much more size, there's much more talent at the Conference USA level, and the thing that Brooks Thompson wasn't ever able to do really was make that transition. And we've talked about it before about several of these sports where UTSA coaches struggle to recruit to the Conference USA level. Mm-hmm. Well, I think Steve Henson's changed that. I think he's starting to recruit at that level. The thing is just being more consistent and finding those guys and defining those roles. At midseason, I had no idea what Cedric Alley's role was. I didn't know what Eric Parrish's role was. Eric Parrish became much more of a 3-and-D type of guy. He seemed to really lock down individually. Cedric Alley really became what I thought he should have been, which was sort of brought the toughness to the court. So you start seeing those roles, but I think Henson really needs to solidify that. Those guys are coming back next year. Tell them, this is what we expect of you. This is how we need to go. This is going to be a pretty good team coming back, and they have the ability to make this run, but he needs that run to really, I think, get everybody even more excited.
Right.
And looking back at the last couple of coaches, you look at Brooks Thompson, he made the NCAA run on year 4. Tim Carter, I think it was year 3, year 4 that he made his run. Then he made another run 3 or 4 years later. So, I think now that's what we're looking for, is a team that's a little more efficient on offense and a better defensive-minded team. And I think we're going to be in a good spot then.
The one thing that I found interesting, though, about, Henson is that I think now we've had 2 years where he's declined postseason tournament invites. I mean, obviously he hasn't made it to the NCAA tournament, but it just kind of seems odd to me that he hasn't tried to take advantage of those invites to, build on the next year. I mean, it's kind of to me, I would see that sort of the bowl season in football, right? You take those extra games, extra playing time, you try to build on it for the next season, but for whatever reason, that just hasn't been his strategy.
It is odd, but maybe it's also money-wise. I mean, that could be a thing that's holding them back, having to go through the travel of whatever tournament they want to get into. But I'm with you. I think the more time this team gets on the court together, the better. Especially now, you look back and you see those missed opportunities that sure Javon and Keaton could have gotten some more chance to show off their skills, but it's these guys like Germany.
Ivy Curry.
Yeah, Ivy Curry. Give them a chance to get into more pressure-filled situations where you can really test them and see, is this what we really have, and what can we recruit to? What else do we need for this team?
All right. All right, well, we have finally kicked off our first spring camp under Jeff Traylor. So let's talk about what we've learned so far from the first week.
So I think that, others probably knew this already, but it's fun to see that the single-digit numbers have been reassigned again. They're up for grabs again. So I think it brings that, that competition back into camp. Who's going to go and get those single-digit numbers again? So, it's going to be interesting at the end of camp when we do another one of these episodes where we look back and say, check out who doesn't have the single-digit number like they did last year. So I don't know about you, but interested to see who maybe has made a jump, who has declined, and does that decline lead to something down the road.
Well, I got to tell you, it was very confusing for me at first because I was looking at, some of the pictures and stuff that came out of spring camp, and I was like, where are these people, and like, why is this person wearing this number that I'm not used to seeing them wear? So it was kind of, it took me a little while to get used to the fact that you're, not going to see Sincere and Rashad and Frank, in these single digit numbers. So that was a little, threw me off a little bit.
Well, yeah, because then you have to look back at what's Rashad's number again? Like, what was his number before?
I don't even think some of them are the same as they were before. I'm not sure.
And it's true. And so that, again,
I had to go back to your roster.
Yeah, led to your confusion to try to figure out, who is this again? Is this really Rashad?
Yeah. But the one thing that I thought was good to hear Traylor say, someone had asked him in one of the interviews, what's your, slogan for spring camp or something like that. And he said, there's no slogan. Like, you're just going to hear me talk about the same things from last year. We're going to talk about the triangle of toughness. We're going to talk about the 2-0. We're going to talk about our culture pillars. So, it was good to hear him kind of say, like, look, we're not coming up with a new, sort of slogan of the week. This is our culture. We're going to continue to talk about our culture. But this year, really, the focus, he said, is on, becoming more player-led. The coaches are going to stop teaching. They're going to look at the super seniors, and they're going to expect those guys, to be the ones teaching the incoming freshmen what the culture is and making sure that it really, becomes something that is player-led versus, just this being coach speak, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that it's obviously been much needed from all the previous teams. You never heard too much about culture. You never heard too much about, this is what our slogan is or whatever. So to see Jeff Traylor putting in, again, having a plan in place to say, my first year, I'm going to be talking about the culture and just really building this and really reinforcing this to the media, to the fans. And now to just say, okay, I spent a whole year doing this. Mm-hmm. It's your turn, seniors. It's your turn, super seniors, to start teaching this to our young guys to make sure this becomes a thing. He talked about with the race facility having the triangle toughness in there, really branding that. So again, he's fine. He's the first coach, I think, that we've really heard this truly is player led. This truly is
right
sinking in. And, it's been much needed. It's what a young program needs really to be planted in order for it to continue to grow and to really become, I think, the type of program that we're hoping that it can be.
Right. The other thing I think that we heard a lot of was just really talking about how they're going to build on the playbook from last year. So, it's nice to see really that we'll have some continuity from, year to year. It's been a while. It's really been a long while when we've had that kind of continuity. There's always, in the last couple of years, there's been some kind of change, whether it was, the offensive coordinator changed, head coach changed. So even though we did have a change at coordinators, they were promotions from within. So, to know that we're going to have the same scheme, the same look, but we're really going to try to build some additional plays on top of that so that we aren't as predictable as we might have been last year, given the lack of training time, I think is good to hear.
It really looks like, what is it, maybe since 2017 that this is the first time where we haven't had coordinator change or, really a shuffle. I mean, you kind of did,
right?
In terms of the defensive coordinator. However, at the very end, you had Jess Lepp really running the Tynex defense. And that's really going to be sort of the thing that kind of keeps going. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's good to see that they're going to, open up the playbook a little bit more. But I think we start now seeing, just as we have talked about now about the culture and in terms of, hey, we need to get this to grow, you're starting to see the playbook start opening up a little bit more in terms of now you're going to start seeing what the true style that Traylor wants to run. My first concern, though, and I get that he gave him some time with Philo. My first concern, though, is, are we really going to try to be as up-tempo as we were at the beginning of last year?
Right.
They really wilted, but again, they were out of shape the beginning of the season. But I don't know that he wants to be as methodical as he was near the middle to the late part of the season, where while they still kind of lined up quickly at times, it was still milking the entire clock to finally get a play to run. It'll be interesting, but I'm just not a fan of going too fast. I understand the benefits of it, and I would say, being able to like change speeds and you dictating why you could do that is probably more beneficial than having to just play up tempo because you don't want the other defense to really set up all the time. So
I feel like part of the reason that we went up tempo so much at the beginning was because we had a limited playbook. And so I think it was just a way to sort of keep the defense, off their game because we didn't have that many plays, so it would become very predictable very quickly if you were giving them time. So I think that was just sort of a way to keep the defense on the heels. And then as you sort of saw us kind of settle in, obviously we couldn't keep up with it because of our conditioning, first of all. And then as the games went on, they did try to add some additional plays to the offense. And so I think that kind of combination sort of caused them to slow down the tempo. So, it'd be interesting to see what happens, but I would be surprised if he tried to go as fast as he did in the first couple of games last season.
I agree. I think that, we try to go as fast. I don't know that that's necessarily what's best for this team or the defense, really. And that's I think where my concern lies more is the defense. And I think it's a good way to kind of transition a little bit and talk about this defense because one of the things the trailer I talked about was they finally got some more depth at some key positions, namely linebacker. And while there was some depth last year, a little bit. It really was. If one guy goes down, you're really starting to challenge that depth. And when you're playing video games, these guys don't come out. Right. But in reality, these guys are coming out. Like, yeah, they may play like 80% of the snaps, but that other 20%, when there's situational plays or they need a breath or something, it can really haunt some of these teams, especially at the UTSA level. So it's good to see that they brought in some new guys. Specifically, though, where I'm really going with this is I heard that Charles Wiley is not really working with the linebackers, kind of being, I think he's working with more with the defensive line, which is interesting because I think that means that he's being moved around a little bit more. He's probably one of the better pass rushers. And so it's good to hear that. But I don't think that ability would have been there to move him around if they hadn't got that depth at linebacker. So I think, you were talking about the offensive playbook and how it's opening up. I think this might open up some really cool things on the defensive front that, may make them, I would say, a little bit more of ball hawks. If they weren't ball hawks last year, they were taking the ball away quite a bit. I think it just opens up some exciting possibilities for this defense.
Yeah, a couple of things to keep in mind with Charles Wiley. When he was at Ole Miss, he started out as a defensive end. And then it wasn't really until I think his last year that he moved to outside linebacker. So, while I read some interviews about him saying, hey, being an outside linebacker was kind of that natural fit for me, that really wasn't the position he played for most of his collegiate career. So, there may be more ability for him to, kind of move back into that defensive end position. I was really hoping, though, that we were going to hear a little bit about the linebackers coach from him. And so when he did say, I haven't really been working with them, I was a little disappointed because I wanted to, kind of hear how it's going with our new coach. He's the only coach. You don't really hear a lot about position coaches during the year.
It's true. And I think, though, in talking about Wiley in terms of him being a defensive end, it's more of he probably gets to get his hands on the ground. Whereas like in this kind of 3-4, 3-3 defense, usually your outside linebackers, they'll put them on the ends and they'll become like pseudo defensive ends. So I might kind of take him back to what he was, sort of that defensive end. But in this true style, this 3-3-4, he won't be like a typical defensive end because he's just going to be too small for that. All the linemen are going to be big dudes. So again, it'll be interesting just how they use him. Like maybe they do kind of switch him out or place him somewhere along the line to really throw off some of these offenses. So I think his versatility and his leadership are going to be huge this season, just to see how some of these young guys see how he's going to be used and potentially they get to be used in that manner too later in their careers.
Yeah. The other thing we got to hear a little bit more about was the quarterbacks. Got to talk to, or listen to interviews from 3 of the quarterbacks. Couple of things we learned from that, we'd kind of heard through the grapevine that Lowell's injury was much more serious than what we thought. We shared that on the pod, or JJ shared that on the podcast when he came on as a guest. But, really got to hear from him what his injury was like and his recovery. So it was good to see him out there, although they are limiting his time and his reps, really to make sure that he does heal from that injury and he's not, trying to rush back. What were your thoughts on the quarterbacks?
Well, I think with Lowell, you're not going to rush him back. There's no reason to. When I saw the injury or when I saw it on TV as we were watching the game, again, going back to that podcast episode that we did, it seemed bad. So I'm not really surprised that when he came back out and he said, "Oh, it was really bad," not just because what JJ had said, but from what I saw and from when I saw him getting carted off, there was just no way that was somebody. It's just a broken leg or anything like that. You could tell it was more serious, and I kind of saw him, but again, whereas you saw Dak writhe around and start crying, and I'm laughing, but Lowell just seemed to kind of take a deep breath and just, all right, it is what it is. He shrugged it off, and maybe he was still in shock.
I was gonna say,
I know you talked about that.
And...
Yeah, but I'm just saying, you do see how tough that Lowell is. So hopefully he gets that speedy recovery. But you see the quarterbacks, and that JoJo's probably 4th. You see that he's heard about some of the COVID issues that he had. Unfortunately, again, it's stunting his growth. It just feels like
COVID protocol issues. Not that he had COVID. Yeah, yeah. Trailer had said they called him COVID JoJo because he was out for 6 weeks, but he never actually got COVID.
But it was secret, right? Because we knew that he had a problem, but he didn't make that public. But then you get to QB1, so that it's Frank and Josh Adkins. And to me, I'm not surprised that Frank is pretty much looking like the 1A. Again, continuity is something you've talked about. I think the way that they're looking right now is that they're going to stick with Frank, even though others may think otherwise, because of what we talked about in terms of recruiting, where, you had Marburger come in, and Marburger looks like Josh. That's the type of quarterback that Traylor clearly is looking for. But for me, I think I don't think there'll be too much movement in terms of QB1, QB2, simply because I just think that that Frank's not going to do anything during this spring to lose the job. I think it's going to be in the fall, after they've gone through some more offseason work, after they've gone through spring practice, that just going to start seeing, is Frank the guy? If not, we're going to go ahead and we're going to replace him. For me, I think opening up in Champaign right now, Illinois, I think it's going to be Frank that's going to walk out. He's going to be the starter, simply because they want continuity. But I also think that he's going to have a short rope. They're going to pull him quicker than they did last year, because I think there's going to be more expectations on this team for next season.
All right. Well, I'm going to disagree with you there, and I'm going to give you my hot take.
Hail Mary shot.
My Hail Mary shot. And I think that when we start in Champaign, that they're going to go with Josh Adkins. And here's why. Here's my case for Josh Adkins. Okay. I agree with you. I don't think they're going to make an announcement or anything, in spring camp. I mean, Frank has had some surgery, and it seems to be helping him in terms of, his knees and that sort of thing. But, I feel like the reason that they went with Frank over Josh last year, if you remember, I don't remember if it was Lunny or Traylor, or maybe both of them, they said, it was a really, really close race between the two of them. And I think the reason they went with Frank last year was because, they needed his leadership. They needed that continuity. Josh was a transfer in, he hadn't had spring camp. He didn't really have a lot of time in the fall to build that rapport with the receivers, or frankly, with the rest of the team. Where Frank, obviously the thing about Frank is that, he's a great guy. He's got, passion for UTSA football. He bought into the culture really quickly. And he had been the starter in the past. So I think that was the thing that gave him the edge. And then the other thing I think they looked at last year was we had a lot of weaknesses at the O-line. We were very thin in that position. And so I think they liked the fact that Frank had the scrambling ability, because I think they thought he was going to need to use it. And he did. But I think this year going in with Josh having a year with the team, having spent some time starting, taking those, first reps or second reps, I think they've seen that Josh has a better arm and has better accuracy. And as we're closing those gaps at the O-line, I think they're saying, okay, ideally we're looking for a pocket passer. Like you said, they recruited Adkins, they recruited Marburger, they're pocket passers. So that's really what I think they're looking for in terms of the long-term, offensive strategy. And I think this year they're going to say, we have the depth to be able to support that. We want to be able to utilize our receivers. Zachary Franklin was out for a lot of the season last year because he had an injury. But we're sitting here with two of the best receivers we've probably ever had at UTSA, in Zachary Franklin and Josh Cephas. And I think they really want to open the playbook to those guys. And the only way that they're going to be able to do that is to have a passer with the accuracy of Josh Adkins. So I think that they're going to go with him for those reasons. I also think the other thing that will give him the edge in the first game over Frank is the fact that we are playing in Champaign, in an outdoor stadium. And that is one of the areas where Frank has really struggled. He does much better in the Alamo Dome, where he doesn't have to deal with wind. So I think, all of those little things are going to combine for them to give Josh the edge. So it's my Hail Mary take right there.
And that's fair. I'll just say this. I know you keep saying accuracy. I think Frank's a little bit more accurate than I've given him credit for. He just has a much weaker arm. And I would say that right. Adkins probably has a stronger arm.
Frank does well at those short passes. He just struggles when he does, a longer pass.
Yeah, and I think, it's fair to say that Adkins should start. I think that Adkins brings a little more of the explosive plays to the offensive playbook, whereas there's a lot more limitation with Frank. So a lot more limitation, I should say, outside of the dome. Right. I think overall you have the same game plan no matter what with Josh. With Frank, I think it's a little bit different depending on that wind. And I go back to December in Dallas when Frank struggled, as we watched in the second and fourth quarters when he had to go up against the wind, and he was having plenty of problems passing. So I get it, but I still think right now that that Frank goes. So we'll see what happens.
I know, and hopefully, the other question mark we have right now is whether or not there's going to be a spring game. So hopefully we'll have a spring game on May 1st, and, we'll be able to go and see where they're at. Although, to your point, I think, right now it's Frank, but I would like to, be able to see the two of them.
So for our listeners, I think it's going to be clear that if the two of us are able to go to the spring practice game, among other people or other fans that are going to show up, Atobes will be in a Josh Adkins jersey.
That's right.
Okay, before we go, let's talk a little bit about how COVID affected sports and really just that UTSA experience. Now that we're kind of coming out of the COVID, people are getting vaccinated, people are, signing up. We should be getting, everybody up and running here within the next few months. The thought of football again back in the dome, getting fans in there to kind of pack it, that camaraderie again, where we get to actually tailgate and actually be next to each other as we talk about UTSA, lament what's happened, have a beer together. For us, we started this podcast during COVID, so didn't really get to meet people. Really have talked to some people over Twitter, so it's going to be a lot of fun to actually see you in person. For me, when I looked back though at COVID sports, there's one thing that I really liked. But I know that Atos has a nice list that she wants to kind of go through. So I'll start out with mine, and I know she'll set me in my place if I say something incorrectly. But for me, the NCAA tournament, both the men's and the women's, specifically though, I'm going to go with the women's tournament here in the San Antonio area. I thought it was terrific that it's only in one spot. Before, you've had all of the first and second round games have been throughout the country, Dayton, Seattle, San Jose, whatever. So you have all the games that kind of go rolling across, and instead you have all these games that are in the San Antonio area where they're being played in some of the different arenas. I thought that was really cool. I thought you had one destination you were going to. You knew that there's going to be fans coming in. They're only going to one spot. So to me, a little easier to do some of the things instead of having to say, well, I'm going to have to fly to Dayton one week, the next week for the Elite Eight, or the Sweet 16, if we make it, we have to go to Indianapolis. And after that, we have to travel to, LA for the Final Four. It's really just, we're going to San Antonio. And no matter what, I'll fly back home, but then I'll come back to San Antonio. So I thought that was a really good way, even though it was to handle COVID, still a really good way for the teams too. It reduced their travel, and I think it made it more cost effective for a lot of these teams. I just wish that there had been an opportunity to see more of the women's games because it was here in San Antonio this year and happened to be here. I wish we would have been able to go out there more. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think would be cool kind of going forward is you'd be able to showcase some of these schools that, really aren't probably going to get that kind of attention before. Like they wouldn't play it at, St. Mary's. Now, again, some of these facilities are not the greatest facilities. They're not what people are used to playing in, but just to kind of have them all in this area was kind of cool, and see some of these other, schools get name recognition, right?
Right.
I think when you do have a large group of fans coming in, it might be challenging depending on what cities they choose, or may limit the scope of cities that they can choose because, you'll need to have hotel accommodations to be able to support that. The benefit of San Antonio is that, because we're such a big, convention city, we do tend to have, more hotel rooms available than a lot of other cities our size would. So I don't disagree with it. I think, it's probably not going to be practical, but, I get where you're going, and I understand, why you appreciated that.
It was fun. I mean, again, it was fun to see some teams go to the historic Convo and then, show up at the Dome, a week later to play their Sweet 16 game. So,
right.
Yeah, really cool. And maybe, again, it's their first and second round games. So, just to me, NCAA, if you're listening, because I know you guys are probably listening,
yeah.
Something to think about. I mean, it was just a really cool experience, I think, here for, South to Central Texas.
Yeah, and maybe you could do some kind of hybrid, right? Like you do first round somewhere else or second round somewhere else, and then you do like Sweet 16 through the championship in one city. Like you could do something like that.
Possibly.
Some of the other things that I think, kind of came out of COVID that, I thought were good things, particularly this spring, seeing FCS football in the spring. I know, that's obviously never going to happen again because they're going to want to push it back, to the fall and kind of do their traditional thing. But I thought that was a good experience for some of these programs to get some, recognition that they wouldn't get otherwise. So it was kind of nice to get to see some of these FCS teams and just see that different level of talent. I think they probably still should have gotten more airtime than they did on ESPN Plus or some of these other stations. But, I'm a graduate of Tarleton. That's where I got my MBA from. I don't a lot of times get to see them play in the fall just because, if a game is going to kind of conflict with UTSA, obviously I'm going to the UTSA games. But to be able to get to see them each week and just focus on Tarleton was kind of fun. And I think some of the other FCS programs probably got some airtime that they wouldn't typically get. And the same thing really with the group of 5 schools in the fall when we were really the only ones playing. the fact that UTSA got to be on national TV as many times as we did in the fall, I think was really a huge thing for the program. And so I think there's going to be a lot of programs that really benefited from, just people talking about them, name recognition, because we weren't competing against, Power 5 schools.
Right.
The other thing that, I think was kind of a good thing, and we'll see if it sticks, is, some of these back-to-back home games with basketball team, rather than them going and playing one game at home and then flying back to the other city and playing, an away game, having kind of these two sort of back-to-back games in one city. I think that cut down on their travel costs. Obviously they did it to try to, help with the COVID protocols, but, I wonder if that's something that we might see stick in future years if, the travel costs really were reduced. That might be something that would really help programs like Conference USA, where you don't necessarily see a lot of money in, the basketball programs.
Right. That's a good, that really is a good idea because, as we kind of battled COVID, it forces us to really, to me, start thinking outside the box and start looking at just some different solutions. And I'd also like that sort of back-to-back home games. Like, you get North Texas to come in here and you get to see them on, Thursday and, Saturday. Right. So hopefully it's something that sticks, even if it's just a Conference USA. I mean, again, to your point, let's look at to see what those costs were. If it did reduce some costs, then let's do it because, it gives an opportunity. I mean, I don't care about having to see, seeing Charlotte or whatever, but if I get to see North Texas here twice or get to see UAB here twice, I think it'll be worth it.
Well, and, if you are going to travel with the basketball team, it makes that more practical, right? Like, you could take a long weekend and go to Dallas if you're going to see them play North Texas 2 times. And, you could get to do some other fun things in the Metroplex.
True.
Some of the other things that I think will probably stick that are just more practical items were, the digital tickets, and being able to, order, from your phone instead of having to stand in line. I mean, some of those things that we saw with COVID protocols, hopefully they stick around because they just seem to make more sense, in general.
And it seems like those are maybe potentially like future things that were going to be built out. But because COVID came around, it forced us to have to adjust.
Yeah.
Then let's adjust. Then let's just keep some of these things because I think that's going to be good.
Yeah. And then I think the last thing I had on my list, and yes, I did have a list. I think the one thing for the players that really came out of COVID was, prior to this year, you would hear coaches say, oh, next man up. And it seemed like a cliche, right? Like, yeah, I'm not going to get my playing time. Yeah, sure, the number one guy could get hurt, whatever. But I think it really drove home that, idea that you really do have to be ready to play because you just don't know what's going to happen. Now, unlikely that we're going to have a pandemic like this, anytime in the near future. Hopefully we don't. But just in terms of injuries and other things that might come up, I think that just really these players seeing that firsthand next man up really matters, I think will kind of just sort of drive home, to these kids that they really do have to be prepared, and that, they could get their shot. You never know when it's going to come, but you got to be able to take advantage of it when it does.
That's a good point. And I think that's what coaches also had to look at and say, this is probably also a good outcome of the COVID is that you probably got more engagement out of your players because, like you said, you could be going into the weekend thinking that player A is your starting quarterback, but then all of a sudden he pops positive for COVID on Thursday or Friday. Mm-hmm. You have to switch to player B. And player B may actually be the third string quarterback. Right. I mean, we saw that a few times with other programs. So yes, absolutely. I think it drives more of the engagement, and I think it helps some of these coaches. So yep. I liked your list.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining us on the Hail Married podcast. I'm A-Toes.
And I'm the Toes.
We'll be back when we have more to report on from the upcoming season, hopefully after we have a spring game.
Yep. See you guys then.